Bienvenidos, señoras y señores, to episode 1 of La Yuma Cubana. Today's topic, Operation Peter Pan, or Operación Pedro Pan. This was a joint effort between the U.S. State Department and the Catholic Church to sponsor Cuban miners using federal funds in order to bring them over to the United States. From the 26th of December, 1960, through the 23rd of October, 1962, so a little under 2 years, 14,048 Cuban children were put on airplanes and sent to America alone, making this the largest unaccompanied children exodus in the Western Hemisphere. So to set the stage, after the U.S.-backed, politically corrupt Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown, he fled Cuba on New Year's Eve in 1958. This allowed Fidel and his rebel army to fabricate power in the following month, January of 1959. This would be known as the Year of Liberation, and the Cuban people were jubilant. There were high hopes and great anticipation for what this new government would bring. Then shortly thereafter, reforms started to take place, in particular that of land, which sought to break up large land holdings and redistribute it to the peasants and to the state. There was a clause that said, in the future, land could only be owned by Cubans. This law struck a chord in the pockets of the foreign landowners, which at the time were majority American. Although there was a promise of compensation, in the eyes of many, this land reform lent credence to the belief that Fidel was a communist. Then in that same year, June 1959, a few weeks after the land reform had been announced, the U.S. sends an official note of protest. This becomes the turning point for the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. Then in the following year, April 1960, it deteriorated even further, when the first 300,000 tons of Soviet crude oil pull up to Havana Harbor. The Cuban government had requested to the American oil refineries that were already in Cuba to refine the oil. But since the interim plan was to break Cuba economically, not to mention the Cold War being in progress, the U.S. government put a lot of pressure on these oil companies to not comply. So when faced with this intransigence, the Cuban government confiscated these assets. Then in July, U.S. President Eisenhower signs an act to reduce the sugar quotas being imported. And at the time, this was Cuba's #1 main export. This left Cuba holding 700,000 tons of surplus sugar, which was later bought by Russia. Then in retaliation, in August, Castro announced that all major American properties would be nationalized, and this included 36 sugar mills and their adjacent plantations, all of the U.S. oil refineries, electric and power companies, telephone utilities. Then in September, all U.S.-owned banks. 3 months later, this decree would extend to railways, port facilities, hotels, and cinemas. In the same month, September 1960, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution were instituted in every neighborhood, almost on every block, with one sole objective: to scrutinize the lives of the Cuban people, asking questions such as, what do you do in your free time? Who do you associate with? Are you for or against the revolution? What's your favorite flavor of ice cream? That last one was a joke, but all this information would be documented. As a spin-off to these committees, youth groups were also established in which children were encouraged to alert the government if they were to hear any talk against the revolution. And this included their own family. Can you imagine the potential for blackmail as a child on that? Niña, limpia tu cuarto, clean your room. And I'd be like, Mom, shall I let Fidel know that you are against his revolution? So imagine living somewhere in which you were not able to express yourself. Not to your spouse or coworkers or family, not in the presence of your own children. Everybody was essentially muted of their emotions and thoughts about what was happening in their country. Nobody wanted to talk about the bearded elephant dressed in fatigues that was in the room. Around the same time, there were education reforms that were also implemented, in which the private schools were closed down for a period of 8 months. Summer camps were made mandatory, and the children would go to a location that was at the discretion of the Cuban government. The curriculum was revamped in order to gear it more towards revolutionary ideologies. Also, there was heavy speculation surrounding a supposed published law with respect to La Patria Protesta. This had parents absolutely convinced that they would be losing their say and rights over their own children. There is controversy around this, in which some people believe that the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA of the US, forged a law to make affluent Cubans believe that the revolutionary government planned to usurp their parental control. Now, also allegedly, some people that helped propagate this fictitious law came forward years later to confess. So basically, the idea is that there was a false law that was printed out using the proper jargon, which the CIA claimed to have stolen from the Cuban government. And remember, this was around the time of the Bay of Pigs and Operation Mongoose, and so some people believe that this was part and parcel of the whole overall scheme, the psychological warfare in order to cause trouble for the Cuban government. At this point, parents sought a way to get their kids off the island until such time that the revolution was toppled, and then they would be reunited. Parents also considered that their child would be receiving an English-speaking education. They wouldn't have to undergo this Marxist indoctrination, and that the separation would be temporary. One of the key individuals in this operation was James Baker, who was the headmaster at Ruston Academy, a private American school in Havana. Parents approached him and asked if he would be able to help. Then in December 1960, Mr. Baker went to Miami to consult with Father Brian O. Walsh, who at the time was the director of the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami. Miami, my country! Before meeting with Mr. Baker, Father Walsh was contacted by the U.S. State Department. They said they wanted to help Cuban parents bring their kids over to the States. However, they needed a social agency, someone to accept responsibility for the children. It was agreed that student visas would be issued. Mr. Baker made sure that the children's paperwork was in order, and they had their $25 in airfare. The names of the children would be placed into embassy pouches and sent from Cuba to Florida. Father Walsh would in turn make sure that those children who did not have any friends or family to claim them at the airport would also have accommodation. It was estimated that at least half of the children did have someone to pick them up. By this time, there were so many exiles already living in Miami. Within the first few months of the revolution, people were like, not my cup of tea, and they dipped. So within the same month that Mr. Baker and Father Walsh met, on the 26th of December, the first Peter Pan flight took off. However, this was short-lived because 1 week later, on the 3rd of January 1961, diplomatic relations were severed between the U.S. and Cuba under the Eisenhower administration. So Father Walsh went over to Washington to find a workaround. And he was told that in lieu of having these student visas, he could issue visa waivers instead, which essentially meant the kids no longer needed a visa. In the same year that the diplomatic relations were severed, 1961, this was known as the Year of Education, and when the campaign to eradicate illiteracy was initiated. Around 40% of Cuba's population at the time was illiterate, and this was mainly due to the abysmal and often non-existent conditions of schools in rural parts of the island. So, 100,000 student teachers were sent out, wearing special uniforms and equipped with oil lanterns so that they can get around the countryside at night. This was a dangerous job because around 40 of them were met with people who were against the revolution and were killed. The outcome to this whole effort was that it rose the literacy rate up to 96%. Almost in parallel, this is when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. And for those of you that don't know, this was the CIA-sponsored operation to arm and train a group of Cuban exiles in order to overthrow Fidel Castro. There were civilian casualties as a result of this invasion, and boys as young as 14 years of age were fighting in the war zone defending their homeland. As you can imagine, this injected Operation Peter Pan with steroids. The number of visa waivers that were being requested increased exponentially. To give you an idea, if within the first 4 months, less than 1,000 children went over, within the next 18 months, 13,000 would follow suit. This went from an 8-group shelter accommodation to over 100 cities and more than 35 states. Children were scattered throughout in foster homes, orphanages, and religious boarding schools. Imagine for a moment that you are a child with your innocence and your naivete. From one day to the next, you are put on an airplane. and you are sent to a foreign country in which you don't speak the language, you don't understand the culture, and you're alone without your parents. I lost my mother once at a supermarket as a child for 5 minutes and almost had a nervous breakdown. To this day, I still have abandonment issues. Some of these children were old enough and their parents sat them down and said, listen, this is an opportunity for you to go abroad and study in the States. Do you want to go? Whereas other children were basically told, you will be going and you will take your sibling with you. I watched a lot of now adult Pedro Pan interviews, and a few of them really stuck with me. There was this one lady who brought her younger brother, and when they arrived to the shelter, he took a few pieces of paper, and from top to bottom, front to back, he wrote 2 words, Mommy Bing, which means Mommy come, just over and over again. There was also an account of a gentleman who had arrived to the group shelter when he was around 13 and remembers having to help the little ones cut their meat at dinner, like their chicken and their steak. And he said at night there would be ceaseless screaming for mommy and Bobby with pain, such pain in their little voices. He said this was one of the most traumatic experiences of his entire life. There was also a woman who came from a very well-to-do family. She was pampered and loved. No le faltaba nada. She had everything she needed. She wasn't even allowed to cross the street alone when she was in Cuba. All of a sudden, she's in an orphanage in Buffalo, New York, in the dead of winter. So for some of these children, it wasn't just the culture shock or the language barrier. It was a physical acclimation. Another story of 2 sisters that were adopted into a German family foster home. And this family had 8 children of their own. But these sisters were essentially made into the house help. They cleaned, they took care of the kids, they cooked. After 6 months of this, they called their caseworker and they said, listen, we'd rather go back to the orphanage than stay in this house. Because of the magnitude of this event, the experiences of the children were varied. On one side, you had those who were traumatized, were physically beaten or sexually abused. On the other side, you had those who were absorbed into loving and nurturing households. Some of the Pedro Pan children grew up to have very successful careers in the States as musicians, writers, professors, held positions in government, and so on. Some parents were able to be reunited with their children in as little as a few months, whereas others had to wait years. There was an account of a man who, once he was reunited with his mother, and she started to tell him what to do, he was like, listen, I've been through a lot. And at this point, nobody tells me what to do. And he said, ironically, the whole fear of her losing parental authority over him ended up happening anyways, but at a much greater sacrifice. He had been so hardened by the experience. He said he cried 1 time at the shelter, and he hasn't cried in his whole life since. Another account of a woman who, once she was reunited with her family, she felt estranged from them. She felt like she had changed so much that she no longer felt close. And yes, this could have been rebuilt, but that gap really had an effect on her. Also consider those children that left at a very young age, like that 2 to 5 year mark. If they were raised in households that were non-Spanish speaking, and it took their parents years to get back to them, once they were eventually reunited, they were unable to communicate because they could only speak English. Fast forward, October 1963, the missile crisis happens, and this halts all flights between Cuba and the States. So any hope of being reunited was nullified, until such time as the freedom flights in 1965 under the Johnson administration. If you were a parent that had a child who participated in this operation, you were given first priority. And it was estimated that of the remaining families, 90% of them were indeed reunited. However, not every parent could exercise this right. Some of them had elderly parents of their own that they couldn't leave. Some due to sickness, some due to incarceration. Some that were not granted permission, for example, if they had a very high skill set that the Cuban government deemed to be essential for the revolution, they were not granted permission. After the missile crisis, it was estimated that there was a whopping 80,000 visa waivers that were waiting to be processed. So this would have just kept on going. This would be an unfathomable situation for any parent. Even if you don't have children, if you have a niece or a nephew, godchild, younger sibling, any child that you love in your life, Think about the feelings that it would evoke to be faced with the ultimatum of having the child stay with you and risk the rumor being true and possibly another invasion happening, or surrendering this child knowing their vulnerability and trusting blindly that they will be taken care of. The opinions and feelings about this operation are very polarized. On one side, you have the Pedro Pans, and now having children of their own, couldn't imagine doing what their parents did. They thought it to be an unnecessary, painful experience that had a high emotional and cultural cost. Then on the other end, you have those Pedro Pans who deemed what their parents did as a selfless sacrifice, as a valiant effort to save the lives of their children. Some were really happy to be a part of the operation and are very thankful to the US government for having funded it. If you haven't asked yourself yet, why couldn't the whole family go together? It's an excellent question. I asked the same thing. However, I was unable to find a definitive answer. When Father Walsh was asked the same question during an interview, his retort was, well, the US government wouldn't allow it for one reason or another. Verbatim, this is what he said. He didn't say for this reason. The CIA has yet to declassify the 1,500 documents that they have with respect to this operation. Even though the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis, both those events have had their files declassified. And this happened around the same time. If this was so altruistic, and if the main objective was to grant political asylum and free them from the tyranny of a communist dictator, then why couldn't the whole family go as a unit? So looking back on this now, the rumors ended up being false, unless you count the ultimatum of the education reform to be a loss of parental control. But these children were never physically taken away from their families. There was a group of Peter Pans that actually went back to Cuba to visit together in order to, and I quote, close this circle in this chapter of life. Many of them have published books on their personal experiences and continue to hold conferences to this day with the objectives of helping kids who are in a similar situation, building awareness so that this does not happen again, and to reunite Pedro Pans worldwide. This concludes episode 1 of Operation Peter Pan, or Operación Pedro Pan. This was a very emotional topic for me, and may it have been thought-provoking and insightful for you as well. Until next time, take care. Cuídate. Ciao.